A single photograph can quietly destabilize everything we think we know about history. In the late 19th century, cameras captured streets, ceremonies, and people with remarkable clarity. But some images contain figures that do not fit the official story. Towering individuals, dressed normally and standing among ordinary crowds, appear far larger than biology is supposed to allow. These are not circus attractions or obvious distortions, yet their presence is rarely discussed. Were they medical anomalies, photographic tricks, or something deliberately forgotten? The photographs raise an uncomfortable question. What if parts of our recent past were edited, not by accident, but by design? Gaurdians in the frame. Imagine a photograph from the late 19th century. The sepia tone has faded slightly, but the details remain sharp. It captures a busy street scene, or perhaps a formal gathering of dignitaries. At first glance, everything appears consistent with the history textbooks. Men in bowler hats, horse-drawn carriages, the familiar trappings of the early industrial age. But then your eye drifts to the edge of the frame, or perhaps standing quietly in the back row of a group portrait. There stands a figure who defies the logic of the scene. This individual is not merely tall, they are monumental, reaching heights of 8, 9, or even 10 feet. They are not dressed as a circus performer or a medical curiosity on display. They are wearing a suit, interacting with the crowd, or leaning casually against a doorway that suddenly seems appropriately sized only for them. This specific image acts as a cognitive wedge. It forces a momentary break in the mental processing of history. The standard narrative, the one taught in schools and reinforced by institutions, tells us that the 19th century was a period of slow, linear evolution. It was a time when humanity was gradually transitioning from agrarian lifestyles to primitive industrialization. In this version of events, human biology has remained static for millennia, and any deviation is a statistical outlier. However, the photograph suggests a different reality. It presents a material truth that is fundamentally incompatible with the official story. This is the moment where the observer moves from a passive consumer of information to an active researcher. The emergence of the Tartarian Empire hypothesis is rooted in this exact shift in perspective. It is not simply a matter of correcting dates or debating the lineage of kings. It is an ontological reassessment of the material world. It challenges the viewer to look at the photographic record of the 1850s through the 1900s, not as a documentation of progress, but as a crime scene of erasure. When these out-of-place artifacts and individuals appear in the frame, they create a friction between his story, the institutional narrative, and our story, the perceived reality captured by the camera. Mainstream history categorizes these towering figures as sufferers of gigantism, isolated medical cases that occurred randomly. Yet, the Tartarian narrative posits that these individuals were not errors of nature. They were the Gaurdians. They were the biological remnants of a preceding, globe-spanning civilization that possessed advanced technology and a unified culture. Their presence in these photographs suggests a social hierarchy and a biological diversity that has been systematically scrubbed from modern consciousness. When you see a 10-foot-tall man standing next to a standard-sized human, and the architecture around them features doorways that soar 20 feet high, the scale of the building no longer feels like an aesthetic choice. It begins to look like a functional requirement for a demographic that no longer exists. This shift in perspective requires navigating what researchers call a simulacrum. This concept suggests that the history we accept as fact is actually a contradictory jumble of sources, crafted primarily in the 16th and 19th centuries to conceal a more complex reality. This crafted history relies on the convenient disappearance of original manuscripts and the allegedly irrefutable proof of authorized experts to maintain the illusion of gradual evolutionary progress. The Tartarian perspective dismantles this linear model. It embraces a cyclic view of time marked by frequent collapses and resets. In this view, the late 19th century was not the beginning of the modern world, but the final transition point of the old one. It was the era where the successor society, the smaller modern population, fully inherited the ruins of the Tartarian world. The psychological appeal of this theory is profound because it speaks to a sense of loss. It promises that the inconsistencies in the historical record are not failures of the student to understand, but failures of the record to tell the truth. It suggests that the world was once more grand, more magical, and more capable than it is today. The anomalous photograph validates the feeling that something is missing. It hints at a lost ancient wisdom that was not just mystical, but tangible and technological. The people in these photographs, these Gaurdians, serve as the last tangible link to that era before the final erasure took place. Investigating these anomalies demands a rigorous approach that crosses the boundaries of photography, architecture, and cartography. It is not enough to dismiss these ideas as digital age misinformation. The persistence of the theory stems from genuine interpretative ambiguities in the material record. The existence of mudflood architecture, where ground floors of buildings worldwide appear buried by sediment, provides a tactile foundation for the belief in a recent cataclysm. The photographic record confirms that the buildings and the people of the mid-19th century often do not match. The inhabitants seem like squatters in palaces they could not have built, using tools that seem primitive compared to the masonry they occupy. This introduction serves as the point of departure. To understand the Tartarian hypothesis is to accept that the camera captured things the history books were written to hide. The Gaurdians in the frame are the silent witnesses to a reset that wiped away a global empire. By following the visual evidence, the structural anomalies, and the cartographic erasures, a new picture begins to form. It is a picture of a world that was stolen, repurposed, and then sold back to the survivors as their own invention. The following examination of the three primary lines of evidence will explore how this shift in perspective transforms the understanding of the past from a linear climb to a cyclical struggle of remembering and forgetting. Traces of the Lost World. The half-century between 1850 and 1900 represents the most volatile period in the proposed Tartarian timeline. This era is not merely a time of industrial expansion and Victorian sensibilities, but the critical window of the reset. It was during these decades that the successor society, the civilization of modern humans, purportedly solidified its control over the earth. They utilized the emerging medium of photography to document their inheritance while simultaneously constructing a narrative to explain its origins. To understand the scale of this deception, one must examine the evidence that refused to stay buried. This evidence segments into three distinct categories: the visual record, the structural record, and the documentary record. The first line of evidence lies in the photographic archives. Mid-19th century photography was intended to catalog the New World and the expansion of colonial powers, yet researchers argue that these early images inadvertently captured the residue of the previous era. The most unsettling phenomenon within these archives is the concept of the empty city. Panoramas taken in the mid to late 1800s of major urban centers, St. Petersburg, Moscow, London, San Francisco, and even Nashville, depict metropolises of finished, magnificent grandeur. The architecture is complete, the streets are paved and wide, and the spires are in place, yet the cities are desolate. There are no bustling crowds, no traffic jams of carriages, and no armies of workers maintaining these massive stone structures. The official explanation often cites long exposure times of early cameras blurring out moving people, but the clarity of flags waving in the wind and the distinct shadows suggests otherwise. The Tartarian theory posits that these photos document the repopulation phase. The successor society had just arrived in these urban centers following a cataclysm, wandering through ghost cities that were already built, waiting to be claimed. Within these frames, the discrepancy in scale becomes impossible to ignore. It is not just the buildings that loom large. The artifacts of daily life appear sized for a different species. Archival images show functional tools and objects that defy standard ergonomic logic for the average human. There are photographs of books so massive they require two grown men to lift them, not merely for display, but clearly designed for reading by someone of much larger stature. Musical instruments, particularly stringed basses and cellos, appear in sizes that would require the player to stand on a ladder or possess an 8-foot wingspan. In industrial settings, heavy machinery from this era often features control levers and gauges placed well above the reach of a standard operator, suggesting the original workforce was biologically distinct from the people photographed pulling the levers. This brings the focus back to the biological anomalies themselves. The so-called giants of the 19th century are often dismissed as circus performers or sufferers of acromegaly, but the context of their appearance tells a different story. Figures like the Chinese giant Chang Wu Gao or the various tall men of the American West are frequently photographed in formal, aristocratic attire. They are not displayed as freaks but stand with an air of authority and integration. Some researchers recontextualize historical figures, such as Emperor Qianlong, suggesting their stature in portraits is not artistic license, but a literal depiction of the fading Gaurdian class. These individuals represent the last generation of the Tartarian biological lineage, coexisting uneasily with the smaller successor population before eventually vanishing from the record entirely. The second line of evidence shifts from the inhabitants to the habitat itself. The built environment provides the most pervasive and tangible proof of a recent global catastrophe. This is anchored in the mud flood theory. In cities across Europe, North America, and Australia, tens of thousands of buildings exhibit a peculiar architectural feature: the submerged ground floor. Mainstream architecture refers to these half-buried levels as light wells or basements designed for coal storage. However, excavation frequently reveals that these levels have full-size doors and windows, often leading nowhere, buried completely by soil. The theory suggests that a massive event, possibly a soil liquefaction cataclysm or a deluge of sediment, raised the ground level by 10 to 15 feet in the mid-19th century. The successor society simply paved over the mud, turning the second floor into the new ground floor and leaving the original entrances buried beneath the sidewalk. Above the mud line, the style of the buildings offers further clues. The structures categorized as classical, Beaux Arts, or Second Empire are reinterpreted not as aesthetic revivals, but as standardized technological infrastructure. The ubiquity of this architecture is startling. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. shares its precise design language, column layout, and dome structure with St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg and the Parliament House in Melbourne. This global uniformity contradicts the narrative of independent, competing nation-states, developing their own styles with primitive transportation. Instead, it suggests a unified, globe-spanning civilization, the Tartarian Empire, that utilized a standardized blueprint. The function of these buildings goes beyond shelter. The domes, spires, obelisks, and intricate metal roofwork, collectively termed Antikythera, are theorized to be components of an atmospheric energy grid. The copper domes and needle-like spires acted as conductors, harvesting electromagnetic energy from the ether to power the civilization free of charge. The sophisticated acoustics and massive stone masonry of cathedrals and state houses were designed to resonate with this energy. The successor society, lacking the knowledge to operate the grid, stripped the wireless components for scrap or repurposed the buildings for government and religious use, inventing new founding dates and architects to explain the existence of structures they could only maintain, not replicate. The third line of evidence is found in the silence of the archives. The textual and cartographic records of the 17th and 18th centuries depict a geopolitical reality that was systematically erased. The smoking gun for many researchers is the 1771 first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. In this volume, Tartaria is not described as a vague region, but is clearly defined as a vast country in the northern part of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and the west. It possessed its own flag, its own emperor, and its own tribute system. It was a sovereign entity recognized by the scholars of the Enlightenment. Yet, as the 19th century progressed, a process of damnatio memoriae began. Maps from the early 1800s show the borders of Grand Tartary shrinking. The land was conceptually carved up and renamed. The northern territories became Siberia, under the claim of the Russian Empire, while the southern regions were absorbed into the Chinese Manchu dynasties. By the 20th century, the name Tartaria had vanished entirely from the atlas, relegated to a historical footnote or a geographic term for the steppe. This was not a natural drift of borders, but a deliberate cartographic erasure designed to hide the extent of the fallen empire. This manipulation extends to the timeline itself. Adherents of the theory point to chronological anomalies, specifically the addition of a phantom millennium to human history. This concept, often associated with the mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, suggests that dates inscribed on cornerstones and coins were altered. The letter I, or J, representing Jesus, was often placed before a date. For example, J750 meant 750 years since Jesus. The Successor Society historians purportedly misinterpreted or maliciously altered this to mean the year 1750, effectively thrusting the events of the past 1,000 years backward. The era of controlled demolition. The transition from the purported Tartarian era to the modern world required a mechanism far more aggressive than the simple rewriting of history books. While paper can be burned and ink can be altered, the physical footprint of a global civilization, granite foundations, soaring arches, and the biological remains of its population presents a stubborn obstacle to any new narrative. Consequently, the early 20th century is characterized in this theory not as a dawn of innovation, but as the Great Cleaning. This was an era defined by controlled demolition, ritualistic destruction, and the systematic removal of the old world's most prominent markers. The first and perhaps most spectacular method of this erasure was the phenomenon of the World's Fair. Between 1851 and 1915, major cities across the globe hosted expositions of unimaginable grandeur. From the Crystal Palace in London to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, these events featured sprawling, temporary cities built in the classical and Beaux Arts styles. The official historical record claims that these architectural marvels, such as Chicago's White City of 1893, were constructed in impossibly short timeframes, often less than 2 years, using a temporary material known as staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fiber. These structures were allegedly designed to be ephemeral, destined for demolition the moment the fairs concluded. The Tartarian counter-hypothesis offers a starkly different interpretation. It suggests that these fairgrounds were not constructed for the events, but were actually the surviving city centers of the Tartarian Empire, excavated and renovated by the Successor Society. The narrative of staff and temporary construction serves as a convenient cover story to explain how a horse and cart civilization could erect massive, ornate domes and waterways that rival the engineering of ancient Rome. By designating them as temporary, the authorities created a legitimate pretext for their destruction. The demolition of these sites was not a tragic waste of resources, but a necessary ritual. It allowed the new administration to showcase the grandeur of the inherited infrastructure, claim credit for its creation to establish their own competence, and then immediately destroy the evidence of the superior technology that built it. The burning of the White City and the dismantling of the St. Louis Fairgrounds were acts of cleansing, ensuring that the populace would not have decades to study the masonry or question why modern construction techniques could not replicate the acoustics and durability of these temporary buildings. While the World's Fairs handled the erasure of specific districts through pageantry, a more violent mechanism was required for the wider urban landscape. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by a suspicious frequency of great fires that devastated the downtown cores of major cities. Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Seattle in 1889, and San Francisco in 1906 all suffered near total destruction of their historic infrastructure. In the official narrative, these catastrophes are attributed to accidents, a cow kicking over a lantern, a glue pot boiling over, or seismic activity. However, researchers view this pattern as a series of managed resets. These fires invariably targeted the most prominent residue of the previous civilization, the massive stone and brick districts that were too large, too old, or too technologically complex to be easily integrated into the new narrative. The physics of these fires often defy explanation, with reports of stone and iron melting in ways that suggest temperatures far exceeding those of a standard timber fire. By reducing these areas to rubble, the successor society achieved two goals. First, they removed the Antiquitech, the stone structures that functioned as part of the atmospheric energy grid. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the destruction allowed for the implementation of new urban grids. This provided the opportunity to raise the street levels and pave over the lower stories of the city, effectively burying the mud-floored levels permanently. The modern concrete and steel city was built literally on top of the charred and buried remains of its predecessor, hiding the evidence of the catastrophe beneath layers of asphalt and modern basements. The final and most contentious aspect of the Great Disappearance is the suppression of the biological record. If the architecture was the shell of the Tartarian world, the giants were its soul. Throughout the 19th century, local newspapers from the New York Times to small-town gazettes frequently documented the discovery of giant skeletons in burial mounds across North America and Europe. These reports were not treated as folklore but as news, detailing remains ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height. Descriptions often included anatomical anomalies such as double rows of teeth or skulls of immense circumference, clearly distinguishing them from the standard human physiology. However, as the 20th century approached, these discoveries ceased to be public knowledge and began to vanish into the vaults of institutions. The Smithsonian Institution is frequently cited by theorists as the primary agent of this suppression. The theory of institutional inertia posits that the scientific establishment functions to protect the dominant narrative of linear evolution. The Darwinian model relies on a progression from small, primitive ancestors to modern humans. The existence of a highly advanced, physically superior race of humans in the recent past would invalidate this entire timeline. It would suggest that modern humanity is not the peak of evolution, but a survivor of a devolutionary event. Therefore, the confiscation of these remains became a political necessity. When mound builders were excavated or giant bones were found during the construction of railways, agents from major museums were often dispatched to collect the finds for study. Once in custody, these artifacts typically disappeared into deep storage or were declared lost in transit. This was not merely scientific bias, it was an enforcement of the evolutionary simulacrum, the scavengers of the ruins. If the photographic anomalies and architectural impossibilities of the 19th century are accepted as valid data points, a fundamental question arises regarding the identity of modern civilization. The standard historical model places the current era at the apex of a long, linear climb from primitive tool-making to the digital age. However, the Tartarian narrative proposes a counterfactual historical hypothesis known as the successor society theory. This model posits that the industrial civilization of the last 2 centuries is not a result of organic innovation or evolutionary rise. Instead, it is a scavenger culture. It is a society that emerged from the ruins of a superior, globe-spanning predecessor, suffering from a fractured memory of its own past. In this framework, the great cataclysm of the mid-19th century acted as a veil, separating the survivors from their history and allowing a new elite to establish a world order based on the appropriation of the old one. The central tenet of this hypothesis is the reinterpretation of the Industrial Revolution. Mainstream history frames the late 1800s as a miracle of human ingenuity, where steam power and electricity were suddenly harnessed to transform the world. The successor society theory argues that this period was actually an era of reverse engineering. The massive infrastructure that defined the Victorian age, the intricate canal systems, the transcontinental railways, and the worldwide telegraph network were not built from scratch by a society that still relied on horses for local transport. They were inherited technologies. The telegraph system, for instance, is viewed not as a new invention of copper wires, but as the reactivation of a pre-existing communication grid that once operated wirelessly through the atmospheric ether. In this scavenger model, the technological progress of the modern era is characterized by a pattern of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. The successor society found the machines of the Tartarian Empire, but lacked the ancient wisdom required to operate them at peak capacity. They took the clean, resonant energy systems of the Antiquitech, the domes and spires that harvested atmospheric electricity, and retrofitted them to run on crude combustion. They converted a system designed for etheric energy into one driven by coal and steam. This explains the dirty, blackened aesthetic of the early industrial cities. It was not the necessary byproduct of progress, but the result of a lower-tier civilization burning fossil fuels to power high-tier machinery they did not fully understand. The steam-powered helicopters and pneumatic tube travel systems found in the fantastical illustrations of the era were not futuristic dreams, but memories of the functionality that was being lost or inefficiently adapted. This perspective fundamentally alters the understanding of the scale argument. When standing before the massive stone edifices of the 1800s, the official narrative insists that these were constructed by people using chisels, pulleys, and wooden scaffolding. The successor society theory suggests that the modern population is merely occupying these spaces, not creating them. We are like children wearing a parent's oversized coat. We fit inside the structure, but the cut and the scale are clearly intended for someone else. The 20-foot doorways, the cavernous hallways, and the staircases with risers uncomfortable for the average human stride are evidence that the current inhabitants are squatters in a palace built for giants. The folk politics of the early 20th century, which focused on small-scale local community projects, served to keep the population grounded in survival. By focusing on the immediate difficulties of life, the new administration prevented the populace from looking up and questioning why the city hall looked like a temple for gods, while their own homes were wooden shacks. The maintenance of this illusion requires a powerful force known as institutional inertia. As societies transition from loose bands of survivors to organized states, the legitimacy of the government becomes paramount. History ceases to be a record of events and becomes a tool of statecraft. The concept of evolution is not merely a biological observation in this context, but a political necessity. The state must be seen as the rational legal authority, the pinnacle of human development. If the population were to realize that a previous society was taller, stronger, healthier, and technologically superior, and that this society was wiped out in a cataclysm that the current government cannot prevent, the legitimacy of the ruling class would collapse. Therefore, institutional inertia works to resist any evidence of the Tartarian past. It is not just scientific skepticism that dismisses the giant skeletons or the mud flood evidence. It is a systemic defense mechanism. When anomalies arise, they are not evaluated on their merits. They are viewed as threats to the simulacrum of linear progress. This is why the Smithsonian and other major institutions must enforce the evolutionary narrative. The existence of the Gaurdians contradicts the story of the ascent of man. To acknowledge them is to acknowledge that humanity has devolved, that we are the broken remnants of something greater. The erasure of the Tartarian Empire is the foundational lie upon which the modern world is built. It allows the successor society to claim ownership of the built environment without admitting they are merely the janitors of a dead civilization. This brings the narrative to the concept of cyclical history. The linear model promises an infinite upward trajectory, but the Tartarian perspective embraces the cycle of the reset. It suggests that civilizations do not endure forever. They rise, reach a peak of high technology and integration, and then suffer a collapse from which they cannot fully recover. The ruins of the previous cycle become the foundations for the next. This implies that resets are recurring events, not singular anomalies. The inability of a society to recover to its pre-event condition signals the beginning of the end. Adherents of this theory look at the modern world through this lens, identifying potential marker events that signal the close of our own cycle. Events, like the global pandemic of the 2020s, are compared to historical collapses, such as the Plague of Athens or the disruptions that theoretically accompanied the mud flood, shadows of the lost empire. The investigation into the Tartarian hypothesis reaches its conclusion not with a definitive answer, but with a coherent model that challenges the very foundation of modern historical understanding. The convergence of photographic anomalies, architectural mysteries, and cartographic erasures presents a picture of the recent past that is significantly less complete than institutional narratives claim. The research reveals 4 distinct pillars that support this counterintuitive view of history. First, the mud flood suggests a catastrophic event occurred in the mid-19th century, burying the lower levels of a global, high-technology civilization. Second, the theory of the inheritors posits that modern humans are a successor society that scavenged the ruins of this empire, claiming its architecture and technology as their own. Third, the Gaurdians, a biological class of giants, were systematically erased from history during this transition. Finally, the simulacrum explains how institutional history was crafted to hide the scale of the predecessor and ensure the legitimacy of the current state. This theory moves beyond historical speculation when applied to the physical properties of the architecture itself. The massive domes and spires of the 19th century, often dismissed as mere religious or governmental ornamentation, may have served a specific function rooted in atmospheric physics. Proponents of the Antikythera theory suggest these structures were components of a global energy grid. This potential can be expressed through the basic principles of atmospheric electricity. While modern science acknowledges this static charge, the hypothesis suggests that the Gaurdians possessed the technology to convert this potential into usable power. This implies that the cathedrals and state houses of the world were not just places of worship or law, but active power plants harvesting energy from the ether. To move this discussion from theoretical modeling to material proof, specific actionable steps must be taken by independent and institutional researchers. The time for passive observation has passed. A rigorous reassessment of the material record is required. First, systematic ground-penetrating radar surveys must be conducted on the basements of 19th-century buildings in global cities. These subsurface structural audits would determine if these lower levels were originally designed as light-deprived cellars, or if they are, in fact, the buried ground floors of a street level that no longer exists. Second, the scientific community must demand a transparent third-party genomic study of human remains found in North American and Eurasian mounds. DNA analysis is the only way to definitively investigate the persistent reports of atypical height and physiology that plague the historical record. Third, a material forensic analysis should be performed on the core samples of any surviving structures from the World's Fair sites. This would verify if these buildings were truly made of temporary staff, or if they contain the high-quality stone masonry of the residue buildings.